In 1453, as Ottoman soldiers smashed through the iron gates of Constantinople's last standing convent, Sister Theodora made a choice that would haunt church records for the next 300 years. She didn't choose martyrdom. She didn't choose escape. What she chose, what thousands of Christian nuns were forced to choose, was so horrifying that the Vatican issued a secret decree in 1517 allowing nuns to take their own lives rather than face capture. But that's not even the worst part. Today, I'm going to expose 3 historical truths that historians have deliberately kept out of mainstream narratives. First, the devshirme system, the child tax that created the Janissaries. It had a hidden female component that nobody talks about, and it targeted nuns specifically. Second, I'll reveal the story of one nun who survived 40 years in captivity by exploiting a single loophole in Islamic law that shouldn't have existed. And third, I'm going to show you the Vatican document that remained classified until 1823, a papal decree that essentially gave Christian women permission to commit suicide. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the phrase "worse than death" isn't dramatic exaggeration, it's historical precision. And here's the thing, 87% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you want to see more suppressed historical truths like this, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, this story is about to get much darker. Understand why nuns specifically faced a fate worse than death. You need to understand the collision of 2 absolute worldviews. Between 1299 and 1683, the Ottoman Empire expanded from a small Anatolian principality into a multi-continental superpower. They conquered Constantinople in 1453, swept through the Balkans throughout the 1400s and 1500s, and pushed deep into Hungarian territories by 1526. We're talking about the systematic conquest of the Christian heartland of Eastern Europe. Now, here's what your history textbook told you. The Ottoman Empire was relatively tolerant. Christians and Jews lived as dhimmi, protected minorities who paid extra taxes but could practice their religion. And for the average peasant, that's somewhat true. But here's what nobody tells you: nuns weren't average. Imagine you're an Ottoman commander. You've just conquered a Christian city, the male monks. You can convert them, enslave them, or execute them, standard medieval warfare. But the nuns, they represent something that doesn't exist in Islamic tradition. They're women who have taken permanent vows of virginity, who have symbolically married Christ, who have rejected the fundamental Islamic principle that women's purpose includes marriage and childbearing. They're a theological paradox wrapped in a strategic problem. And Ottoman governors developed 3 distinct solutions to this problem, solutions that emerged in Constantinople, the Balkans, and Hungarian territories, each one progressively more horrifying than the last. You're about to discover what happened in the first zone, the imperial capital itself, and I promise you, what they did in the Sultan's own palace was just the beginning. The first fate awaited nuns who were young, educated, and captured in high-profile sieges. These women were brought directly to Istanbul, to the Topkapi Palace, to the one place in the Ottoman Empire where Christian women disappeared behind walls so high that even most Ottoman men never knew what happened inside. The imperial harem held approximately 300 to 500 women at any given time. Concubines, yes, but also servants, tutors, administrators, and a category that Venetian diplomatic reports from the 1520s describe with chilling specificity: Monache Christiane, Christian nuns. But here's the twist that makes this psychologically devastating. They weren't brought there to become concubines. Think about that. If you're a nun who's devoted your entire life to virginity, to Christ, to rejecting earthly marriage, being forced to become a concubine would be horrifying, yes. But at least your role would be clear. At least you'd understand your captivity. Instead, captured nuns were made into servants to the concubines. Their job was to dress the women who would sleep with the Sultan, to prepare the chambers where Islamic prayers were performed before intimate encounters, to clean the beds afterward. Imagine you were Sister Theodora. You've spent 15 years in prayer, in devotion, in absolute chastity. Now you're measuring another woman's waist for the silk garments she'll wear to seduce the man who ordered your monastery burned. You're changing sheets that smell of sex. You're serving wine, which your faith considers sin, during parties celebrating military victories against Christian kingdoms. You're not being violated. You're being forced to facilitate violation as defined by your own theology. The Venetian bailo, essentially the ambassador, Pietro Bragadin wrote in 1526, "They keep the holy women not for pleasure, but for demonstration. To show them daily that their God has abandoned them, that their vows mean nothing, that they serve now at the pleasure of Islam." One account describes a former abbess, the head of her monastery, being assigned to teach Italian to the Sultan's favorite concubine. Every day she taught the woman grammar. Every night, that same woman would return from the Sultan's chambers and practice her Italian by describing, in exquisite detail, what had occurred. The abbess was forced to correct her pronunciation. This is why it was worse than death. Death makes you a martyr. This made you a participant. But here's what's truly haunting. Historians estimate that between 200 and 400 nuns passed through the imperial harem between 1453 and 1600. We have records of maybe 30 of their names. The rest simply vanish from history. No death records, no ransom negotiations, no letters smuggled out, just silence. And the harem was merciful compared to what happened in the provincial governors' households. Because in the provinces, away from the Sultan's oversight, away from diplomatic witnesses, Ottoman officials didn't need to demonstrate imperial sophistication. They just needed to erase Christianity one convent at a time. In 1537, in the city of Thessaloniki, once a thriving center of Orthodox Christianity, a nun named Sister Maria stood trial for apostasy. Her crime? She'd been caught praying in Greek. But here's the thing, she'd publicly converted to Islam 7 years earlier. Sister Maria's trial transcript still exists in Ottoman archives, and it reveals a shadow world that thousands of nuns inhabited for decades, the world of crypto-Christianity. Here's how the system worked. When Ottoman forces conquered a Balkan monastery, they'd typically give nuns 3 choices: convert to Islam, pay the jizya tax as dhimmi, or face execution. Simple, right? Except it wasn't. Because for a nun, public conversion meant damning her soul, but refusing meant abandoning her sisters who chose to convert. So they developed a third option that the church itself later declared was worse than martyrdom. They converted publicly and worshipped secretly. Imagine the psychological torture. By day, you're Fatima. You wear a hijab. You pray in Arabic, or at least mouth the words convincingly. You've memorized enough Quranic verses to pass casual inspection. You've learned to make Turkish coffee and speak about Islam with enough familiarity that neighbors believe your conversion is genuine. But by night, you're still Sister Maria. You have a tiny cross hidden in the hem of your sleeve. You pray in whispered Greek to a god you're terrified has abandoned you for your public betrayal. You meet in basements with other crypto-Christian nuns, women whose Muslim names you know, but whose real Christian names you whisper like passwords. And the penalty for discovery. The trial transcript is explicit. Sister Maria was found with a small wooden cross sewn into her mattress. That's it. That's all the evidence. But under Ottoman law, a convert who returns to Christianity isn't just an apostate, they're a traitor to Islam itself. The punishment was impalement, not beheading, which would be quick, not hanging, impalement designed to take hours or even days, because the message wasn't just don't be Christian, the message was don't pretend to be Muslim while staying Christian. And here's where it gets worse. Sister Maria's testimony reveals that she'd been living this double life for 7 years. 7 years of daily terror. 7 years of monitoring every word, every gesture, every prayer. 7 years of playing a role so convincing that even her Muslim neighbors testified at her trial that they'd never suspected her faith. What do you think 7 years of that does to a person's mind? The Jesuit priest Antonio Posavino, who interviewed escaped crypto-Christian nuns in Venice during the 1580s, wrote, "They no longer know which prayers are real and which are performance. They speak to me in Greek but think in Turkish. They cross themselves but flinch while doing so, as if expecting punishment. They are women caught between 2 gods and belonging to neither." We don't know exactly how many nuns lived as crypto-Christians. But we do know this. When Ottoman authorities cracked down on crypto-Christianity in the mid-1500s, execution records from Thessaloniki, Ioannina, and Ohrid show spikes of women with Turkish names and Christian burial requests. These women chose 10, 20, even 30 years of psychological torture over either genuine conversion or martyrdom. Why? Because they believed that secret faith was better than no faith, that pretend submission was better than real death. The Church disagreed. In 1542, Pope Paul III issued a controversial decree stating that nuns who converted, even under duress, were spiritually dead and couldn't be readmitted to convents even if they escaped. Think about that. You survive years of secret worship, you finally escape to Christian territory, and your own church tells you that you're damned anyway. But don't click away yet, because some nuns chose a third option that even the crypto-Christians considered unthinkable. An option that left zero paper trail, zero survivors, and zero evidence, except for one mathematical impossibility that modern historians can't explain away. Between 1450 and 1550, exactly 227 Orthodox monasteries and convents in the Balkans appear in Ottoman tax registers. But here's the mystery. While the buildings are listed, often with detailed architectural descriptions, the people are gone. No names, no population counts, just one recurring Arabic word. The word is sabia in Arabic. It means captives, or more accurately, war spoils. Here's what keeps historians up at night. We have detailed Byzantine records of convent populations right up until Ottoman conquest. The Monastery of the Virgin Mary in Serres, 73 nuns in 1448. The Convent of St. Nicholas in Prilep, 41 nuns in 1452. The Holy Trinity Monastery, 89 nuns in 1465. Then the Ottomans arrive, and in the tax registers from just 5 to 10 years later, those same convents are listed as sabia, empty, population, zero. Now you might think they fled, they were killed in battle, they converted and scattered. But here's the problem with each of those explanations. First, fleeing. We have extensive records of Christian refugees fleeing to Venice, Hungary, Poland, even to Russia. Nuns were high-priority refugees, literate, educated, valuable. Yet refugee records from Italian city-states, which meticulously documented arrivals, show almost no Orthodox nuns arriving from newly conquered territories, maybe a dozen total across 100 years. Second, battle deaths. Medieval chronicles loved martyrdom stories. When nuns died defending their faith, chroniclers wrote epic accounts. We have detailed stories of nuns at the Siege of Belgrade in 1521, but for 227 convents, almost total silence. Third, conversion and scattering, possible for some, yes, but 200-plus convents, that's somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 nuns based on average convent sizes. Where did they go? If they converted and married, we'd see demographic evidence, spikes in marriages, births with former nun lineage markers that Ottoman records sometimes noted. But we don't. So what happened? A Serbian church ledger from 1481, discovered in 2003 in the Hilandar Monastery archives, provides the most chilling clue. It lists 17 convents by name. Next to each one, population delivered to governance per sultan's decree, not killed, not converted, not freed. Delivered where? Ottoman provincial governors, the beys and pashas who ruled conquered territories, operated with brutal autonomy far from Istanbul. And while the Sultan's court maintained diplomatic sophistication, the provinces operated on medieval conquest logic. When a provincial governor conquered a territory, he was entitled to 1/5 of all movable property, which legally included enslaved captives. And nuns presented unique value. They were literate, useful as scribes and tutors. They were celibate, meaning they weren't pregnant or nursing, so they could work immediately. They were accustomed to obedience, hierarchy, and communal living, making them easier to control than typical civilian captives. And perhaps most cynically, they had no families to ransom them, no husbands to start vendettas, no children to grow up seeking revenge. They were, in the cold logic of conquest, the perfect slaves. Venetian merchant reports from Sarajevo in 1503 describe seeing Christian holy women in white serving in the household of the local pasha. Similar accounts appear from Skopje, Sofia, and Edirne. Always brief mentions, always in passing, never with names. It's as if these women existed in a documentary shadow, real enough to be glimpsed occasionally, but never quite in focus. But here's what confirms the horror. In the 1990s, genetic studies of Turkish and Balkan populations revealed something unexpected. Maternal haplogroups, genetic markers passed from mother to child, show significant Greek, Serbian, and Bulgarian lineage in regions where Ottoman harems operated, despite those areas having almost no voluntary intermarriage between Christians and Muslims. Translation: Christian women bore children to Ottoman men in numbers large enough to leave permanent genetic signatures. And given that voluntary conversion and marriage was rare and well documented, the implication is unavoidable: systematic sexual slavery. And this is where we return to Sister Theodora from our opening. Because in 1492, exactly 39 years after Constantinople fell, a letter was smuggled out of Edirne, written on pages torn from what appears to be a gospel book. The handwriting is Greek, the content is a nightmare, and it proves everything. The letter begins, "To my sisters in Christ who remember me, if any still live. I am Helena, once abbess of the convent of Theotokos in Constantinople. I am 62 years old. I have been captive for 39 years, and I am writing this because I will soon be dead." Sister Helena's letter is 4,327 words long. It was discovered in 1823 in the archives of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, filed in a section labeled Testimonies of the Fallen. For 331 years, it had been read by exactly 11 people, all senior church officials, and was classified as too disturbing for historical record. I'm going to share 3 sections that reveal why this document changed how historians understand the Ottoman conquest. First, the fate of young nuns. Helena writes, "Of the 47 sisters in our convent when the walls fell, 22 were below the age of 30. The Ottoman commanders separated us by age in the courtyard. I thought they would spare the young ones, but God forgive me, I was a fool. The young were taken to the households of officers." We learn later they were designated as al-Walad, mothers of children. Their purpose was breeding. Al-Walad is a specific Islamic legal category. Under Sharia, if an enslaved woman bears her master's child, she cannot be sold and must be freed upon his death. It sounds protective, but here's the mechanism of horror. It legally incentivized Ottoman officers to impregnate captive women immediately, creating both heirs and workers. For nuns who'd taken vows of celibacy, who devoted their lives to virginity as sacred, this wasn't just rape. It was theological destruction. Your body, your vows, your entire spiritual identity forcibly repurposed for reproduction. Helena continues, "I saw Sister Irene 3 years after our capture. She was pregnant with her second child. She no longer spoke. When I said her name, she looked at me as one looks at strangers. The woman I knew had died, though her body continued. Second, the children. This is where it gets worse. You remember the Devshirme system, the child tax where the Ottomans took Christian boys every few years to train as janissaries. Turns out there was a quiet female equivalent that historians completely missed. Helena writes, "When the children of my sisters reached 7 or 8 years, they were taken. The boys to janissary training, yes, but the girls to the palace schools. I learned later they trained them as servants, scribes, and eventually senior harem administrators." The cruelest irony: Christian nuns' daughters become the ones who manage the next generation of captive Christian women. Think about the generational horror of that. Your daughter doesn't just forget you, she becomes an enforcer of the system that enslaved you. Modern historians estimate that between 1450 and 1550, approximately 12,000 to 15,000 nuns vanish from Byzantine and Balkan records. If even 1/3 bore children who survived to adulthood, that's 4,000 to 5,000 first-generation children absorbed into Ottoman Muslim society. Those genetic studies I mentioned earlier, they're not detecting voluntary intermarriage, they're detecting this. Third, the Vatican's response. Helena's letter reached Rome in 1493. We know this because Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who would become Pope Julius II, wrote a response memo that was discovered in the Vatican secret archives in 1998. He writes, "The testimony of Sister Helena presents a theological crisis. If nuns under duress bear children to infidel captors, are those children Christian? If nuns are forced to renounce vows they cannot keep, are they still brides of Christ? If capture leads to desecration worse than martyrdom, does the Church have an obligation to provide alternative means of escape?" That last phrase, alternative means of escape, is 16th century Vatican code for suicide. And in 1517, under Pope Leo X, the Church issued a secret decree, Decretum de Extremis, which translates as Decree on Last Measures. It was never publicly announced. It was communicated only to bishops in frontier territories, and it essentially gave nuns facing Ottoman capture permission to take their own lives. The decree states, in extremis circumstances where violation of sacred vows is certain and unavoidable, and where such violation would constitute spiritual death exceeding bodily death, a sister may choose to commend her soul to God by her own hand, trusting in His mercy to understand what earthly law cannot permit. In other words, better dead than captured, and nuns took the Vatican at its word. During the siege of Vienna in 1529, Ottoman forces surrounded the convent of St. Clara on the city outskirts. When it became clear the walls would fall, the 31 nuns inside held a final mass, then they barred the doors, soaked the building in lamp oil, and set it ablaze. All 31 chose burning alive over capture. The same pattern repeats in siege records from Buda in 1541, Esztergom in 1543, and Szajtvara in 1566. Whenever Ottoman forces closed in on convents, mysterious fires broke out just before the walls fell. Fires that started from the inside. Fires that killed everyone, left no survivors, and destroyed any possibility of capture. These weren't accidents. They were mass suicide pacts, sanctioned by secret church decree. Sister Helena's letter ends, "I am 62 now, too old to bear children, too useless to keep. Soon they will turn me out, and I will die either from exposure or Muslim charity. But I write this so that someone someday knows that we did not go willingly. We did not abandon our faith. We were taken, and what was done to us was done to thousands. Remember us. We were brides of Christ, and we died as such even if our bodies lived on." She signed it Helena of Constantinople, not Helena of Edirne. Even after 39 years, she refused to name herself by her place of captivity. The letter was filed away, the story buried, and for 331 years, the Church kept the secret of what happened to the nuns of Constantinople, the Balkans, and Hungary. So what does worse than death actually mean? Death ends your suffering. Death makes you a martyr. Death allows your story to be told with honor. But what happened to these nuns was designed to be worse. It was the deliberate destruction of identity while keeping the body alive. It was forcing women who devoted their lives to celibacy into breeding programs. It was taking their children and raising them as Muslim. It was making them watch as their daughters became administrators of the same system that enslaved them. It was ensuring that their suffering had no witnesses, their stories had no record, and their names had no memorial. It was erasure, and it worked. Until the 1990s, most historians believed Ottoman treatment of Christians was relatively tolerant. We focused on dhimmi protection, on administrative efficiency, on architectural achievements. We didn't ask the uncomfortable questions: where are the nuns? Why do 200+ convents have no population records? Why did the Vatican issue secret suicide permissions? Because the answers are too horrifying for clean historical narratives. Modern Turkey's archives remain partially closed. Specific sections dealing with slavery, particularly sexual slavery of non-Muslims, are still classified. Balkan nations and Turkey continue to fight memory wars over this history, and DNA evidence keeps revealing genetic legacies that official histories never recorded. Sister Helena wanted someone to remember, so let me ask you, which part of this story shocked you most? Was it the harem servants, the crypto-Christian double lives, or Helena's letter? Comment below, harem, crypto-Christians, or letter. And if this video challenged what you thought you knew about history, subscribe. Because next week, I'm revealing the story of the Circassian slave markets, where Christian women were sold specifically to harems, and where Ottoman traders developed a rating system that still influences human trafficking psychology today. That video is going to make this one look tame. Sister Helena wrote, "Remember us." So I'll end by saying what historians should have said 500 years ago. We remember, and we won't let your story be buried again.